The night of the Hargrove ball, Cecily Wyndham counted 17 women more beautiful than herself and decided it did not matter. She stood near the window at the far end of the ballroom, a glass of champagne she had not touched growing warm in her gloved hand, watching her mother work the room with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years converting charm into currency. Lady Dorothea, Wyndham moved from cluster to cluster. A laugh here, a touch of the arm, there the particular smile she reserved for men of title and means. Cecily knew that smile. She had grown up in its shadow. The Wyndham estate in Shropshire had been mortgaged twice. It's the second time. Cecily had been 17, and she had overheard enough of her father's conversation with the solicitor to understand that overheard was not the right word. She had stood outside the study door, with her hand pressed flat against the wood, and listened with the particular attention of someone learning, for the first time, that the floor beneath her was not solid. Her father had died the following spring, not from the debt, or not exactly, but Cecily had never entirely separated the two. That was 6 years ago. Now she was 23, the sole remaining Wyndham of any consequence, and her mother had brought her to London for the season, with a stated purpose, so plain it barely needed stating. Find a husband, find one quickly, find one with enough to cover what was left. Lord Fenwick had been identified as the most promising candidate. He was 47, recently widowed, and possessed of a baronetcy and a moderate fortune in the wool trade. He had danced with Cecily twice at the Pemberton supper and watched her the way a man watches something he is considering purchasing, with interest but no particular warmth. Her mother had taken this as encouragement. He inquired about your accomplishments. Lady Dorothea had said afterward, on the ride home, adjusting her gloves, with the satisfied air of a woman who has moved a chess piece well. I told him you played piano and managed a household. He seemed pleased. Cecily had said nothing. She was becoming very good at saying nothing. At the Hargrove ball, Fenwick danced with her a third time. He held her hand, with a firmness that felt more like possession than courtesy, and spoke at length about his estate in Northumberland, which was very large and very cold, he said, and required a steady hand to manage. He said the word, steady the way men said it when they meant obedient. Cecily smiled and said that sounded very admirable, and thought about the window. It was after the fourth dance, with a different partner, a cheerful young Viscount, who talked about nothing but horses, and did not seem to notice she barely responded. That she slipped out through the side corridor, found a door that led to the back terrace, and let herself through it. The night air was cold and clean and smelled of wet stone and the distant coal smoke of the city. She stood at the terrace railing and breathed. Hello. In the narrow lane that ran alongside the Hargrove townhouse, a man was sitting on an overturned crate with a book open across his knee and a small lantern balanced on the cobblestones beside him. He was not dressed for the evening. His coat was worn, his boots badly scuffed, and his collar plain and turned up against the cold. He did not look up when the terrace door opened. He was entirely absorbed in whatever he was reading, one hand resting on the page to keep it from turning in the wind, his brow slightly furrowed. Cecily watched him without meaning to. A cat appeared from somewhere, a thin, half-wild thing, moving along the base of the wall with the cautious deliberateness of an animal accustomed to disappointment. The man looked up from his book. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small piece of something, bread perhaps, or a scrap of meat, and held it out without fanfare, without coaxing, simply offering and waiting. Ian. The cat considered this for a long moment, then crossed the distance and took it. The man watched the cat eat with an expression Cecily could not quite name. Quiet satisfaction, perhaps. Cecily. The particular contentment of a person who has done a small right thing and expects nothing in return. She became aware, then, that she had been leaning on the railing, watching a stranger feed a stray cat for nearly 2 minutes. She straightened. He chose that moment to glance up, and they looked across the distance. And the woman in silk on the terrace above, the man in the worn coat below. For precisely long enough that looking away would have been its own statement. At her. He nodded once, with the economy of someone accustomed to moving through spaces where he was not expected to speak first. Then he looked back at his book. Cecily went back inside. She danced with Lord Fenwick one more time. On the ride home, her mother outlined the terms of what she called a very promising arrangement. A formal courtship, a spring wedding, a settlement that would, she said, breathe life back into the Wyndham name. Cecily sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the dark streets sliding past the carriage window and said, "I understand, Mama," which was not the same as yes. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed of their rented townhouse rooms and looked at the ceiling and thought about Northumberland and the word steady and the cat in the lane below the terrace and the man who had given it something to eat without requiring it to be grateful. She found him again, which she had not been planning to do. It was 3 days later, at the lending library on Mortimer Street, where she had gone to return 2 novels and to stand among books long enough to feel like herself again. She was reaching for a volume of natural history. She had always preferred it to philosophy, let's say, which seemed to her a great deal of words in service of conclusions any sensible person could reach on their own. When she became aware of someone standing at the other end of the same shelf, also reading, it was the man from the lane. He was better lit now, and she could see him more clearly. Younger than she had estimated, perhaps 30 or a little past it, dark hair, an intelligent face that was not precisely handsome, but held the kind of attention that made handsome seem beside the point. He was reading with the same focused quality she had noticed before, as though the world around him was a mild inconvenience he was willing to tolerate, until he reached the end of the paragraph. Picked up, recognized her the same moment she recognized him. There was a beat of something. "The terrace," he said. It was not quite a question. "The lane," she replied. He had the grace not to look embarrassed about the cat, which she appreciated. "Thomas Calloway," he said, and held out a hand in the straightforward manner of someone who did not particularly care that this was not how introductions between strangers of uncertain social standing were supposed to go. "Mrs. Wyndham," she said, and shook it. He asked whether she was interested in natural history, or had simply picked that book up to have something to hold. It was a perceptive question, and she found herself answering it honestly, which was not something she did often with people she had known less than 4 minutes. They talked about the book, and then about 2 others, and then, because neither of them seemed inclined to stop, and the library was quiet enough that they could speak without performing. They sat at the small table near the window and talked for rather longer than she had intended. He was, she gathered, working as a land agent for a property outside the city. He spoke of it with practical knowledge and without pride, describing drainage problems and tenant disputes, and the particular difficulty of negotiating between landowners who would not listen and labourers who had stopped expecting to be heard. He asked her questions and listened to the answers with a quality of attention she was not accustomed to. Not the polite listening of men waiting for their turn to speak, but the real kind, the kind that occasionally resulted in him saying something that made her revise what she had just said. She did not tell him about Lord Fenwick, Dicknall. She did not tell him about the mortgage or the solicitor or the 6 years of managing on less and less, while her mother continued to behave as though less and less was simply a temporary misunderstanding. She told him about Shropshire, and the way the light fell across the hills in late afternoon, and a particular oak tree at the edge of their property that she had climbed every summer until she was 15, and which she was fairly certain still stood. He listened as though this mattered. She walked back to the townhouse in better spirits than she had known in months. She did not examine this too carefully. She went back to the library on Thursday. He was there. They talked again. She went back the following Monday, and the Monday after that. Her mother, occupied with the architecture of the Fenwick arrangement, did not ask where she had been. It was in the 5th week that she told him. They were walking in the park. She had told the housemaid she was meeting a friend, which was, she supposed, not entirely untrue, and he was describing a standoff with a particularly intractable landowner when she stopped walking and said, simply, "I am to be married." He stopped too, looked at her. "To Lord Fenwick," she said. "It has not been formally announced, but my mother considers it decided." The park was grey-skied and half empty, the trees bare, a pair of ducks moving in a resigned way across the surface of the pond. She watched the ducks. "Do you consider it decided?" he asked. This was, she had come to understand, very characteristic of him. He went directly to the question that mattered, without dressing it in the socially acceptable clothing that would have made it easier to deflect. "I consider it," she said carefully, "necessary. Those are not the same thing." "No," she said, "they are not." She told him about the mortgage then, about her father and the solicitor, and the particular arithmetic of her family's situation that had gradually converted every choice she had into a calculation. She told him, without looking at him, watching the ducks, her voice even and precise, the way she had learned to talk about things that mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What would you choose," he said, "if it were only a choice?" She had not let herself think about that in years. The not thinking had become so habitual, she sometimes forgot she was doing it. She stood in the grey park and actually thought about it, and the answer came up so quickly it surprised her. "In real," she said, "someone who listens, a life that is mine." He nodded slowly. Not with the sympathy she had expected, not the look people gave her when they wanted to convey that they understood without being required to do anything about it, but with the expression of a person who is thinking seriously. "Then I have something to tell you," he said. What he told her took some time to absorb. His full name was Thomas Harlan Calloway. He was not, in fact, a land agent, or not only, say. The property he managed was, technically, his own, a substantial estate in Derbyshire held in the Calloway name for 4 generations. His grandfather had been granted the Viscountcy in 1788. He was, by the accurate accounting of things, Viscount Calloway, possessed of considerably more than anyone who met him in libraries and parks would have reason to suspect. He had come to London under a different account of himself, he explained. Because he had spent 3 seasons being pursued by women, and, more accurately, by their mothers, who had never spoken an honest word to him, or asked him a single question that was not, at its core, about what he was worth. He had found it exhausting and a little desolating. A friend had suggested, half-jokingly, that he might discover what real conversation felt like if he went about without the title. He had tried it, and he had discovered that it felt, in fact, exactly like talking to her. Cecily stood very still and listened to all of this. Then she said, "You could have told me sooner." "Yes," he said. He did not make excuses for this, which she respected. "I should have. I didn't want it to change what was between us," which was, I recognize, its own kind of dishonesty. She looked at him. She thought about the cat in the lane, the library, Edgerton. Months of conversations in which she had said true things to another person, and felt, for the first time in years, that the saying of them had landed somewhere. She thought about the look on his face when she had described the oak tree in Shropshire, the way he had asked her whether she had ever gone back. She thought about Lord Fenwick and the words steady and Northumberland. "I am very angry," she said, "and I need several days to think." "That is entirely fair," he said. She walked home alone. The several days were, in fact, 4 days of considerable interior turbulence, during which she was colder to her mother than usual, and could not concentrate on anything for longer than 10 minutes, and went over the whole sequence of events so many times that it lost its shape, and she had to let it settle before she could see it clearly. What she kept returning to, in the end, was simpler than she expected. He had hidden something significant. That was true, and she was not prepared to minimize it. But he had not hidden himself. Every conversation had been real. Every question he had asked had come from genuine curiosity. He had listened, actually listened, in a way that had nothing to do with what he stood to gain, because as far as she could tell, he had not been standing to gain anything. She thought about that for a long time. On the 4th day, her mother arrived at the breakfast table with a letter and an expression of calm triumph. Lord Fenwick, it appeared, had written to formally propose the courtship. Her mother set the letter beside Cecily's teacup as though setting down a solved problem. "You'll want to read it," Lady Dorothea said. Cecily looked at the letter. She thought about the word steady, Icklander, about what a life in Northumberland managed with obedience and silence would cost not in pounds, but in the particular currency she had only recently understood she had been spending down for years. "Mamma," she said, "I am not going to accept Lord Fenwick." The conversation that followed was long and very unpleasant. Her mother deployed, in order, disbelief, argument, recrimination, the names of their creditors, the memory of her father, the general observation that Cecily was throwing away the only reasonable option she had been given. Cecily waited until it was done. "I have a different option," she said. "I would like to tell you about it." She wrote to Thomas that afternoon. Not a long letter. She had never been someone who used more words than the situation required. She said that she had thought about what he'd told her, and that she had questions, and that she would like to meet on Thursday at the library if he was willing to begin the process of answering them properly. He was there when she arrived. He stood up when she came in, which she noted without comment. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and said, "Start at the beginning." He did. He told her about his family. His mother, who had died when he was 12, and whom he had clearly loved. His father, who had been a serious, somewhat remote man, Tiffany, more comfortable with the land than with people, and a younger sister, who was now 20 and apparently delightful, and had written him 3 letters asking when she was going to meet this woman he kept not mentioning, but who was obviously the reason his last letter had sounded different. He told her about the estate, its challenges, and what he hoped for it. He told her what he thought about inheritance and responsibility, and what it meant to hold something in trust for people who depended on you. He asked about her plans for the Wyndham property, the remaining portion, the parcel that had not yet been mortgaged. He asked as though he actually wanted to know what she thought. Explaining. She found herself explaining, more fully than she had to anyone, what she had been trying to do, and what she had not been able to manage alone. At the end of 2 hours, she said, "I have one more question." "Yes," he said. "Was any of it? The library, the park, all of it, was any of it a strategy?" He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. 18. "It was the only part of these last several months that wasn't." She believed him. Not because she was credulous. She had not been credulous since she was 17 and learned about the mortgage, but because she had spent a considerable number of hours in his company attending to what he said and how he said it, and she trusted her own observation. "All right," she said. "Then I think we should talk seriously about what comes next." What came next required, among other things, a formal introduction. Thomas's actual formal introduction to Lady Dorothea Wyndham, which took place in the sitting room of the townhouse on a Tuesday morning, and which was one of the more remarkable hours of Cecily's life. Her mother had received the information that her daughter had been spending her Thursday mornings in conversation with a Viscount in a lending library, with an expression that cycled through several distinct phases before settling on something that might charitably be called strategic recalibration. By the time Thomas arrived, Lady Dorothea had composed herself into graciousness. Thomas was, to his credit, entirely unimpressed by her graciousness and entirely pleasant about it. He spoke to her mother with the courtesy due the occasion, and the directness that Cecily had come to understand was simply how he was. He stated his intentions clearly, acknowledged that the arrangement was unconventional, and suggested that perhaps unconventional arrangements sometimes produced the most honest results. Lady Dorothea, who had not survived 30 years of social navigation without recognizing which way the tide had turned, agreed that this was possible. Cecily sat slightly to the side and watched this exchange with a feeling she identified. After a moment, as relief so complete, it felt almost like grief, the kind that comes not from loss, but from the ending of a long, exhausting holding on. The Wyndham property in Shropshire was not lost. It required, in the end, a straightforward resolution of the outstanding mortgage. Thomas handled it with a lack of fanfare that she found characteristic, and a considerable amount of practical planning about what the estate could actually sustain and how. They spent the first months of their engagement doing this, walking the property, talking to the tenants, sitting at the table in the old study, where her father had once received his solicitor, and working through the numbers together. He was good at it. Better than she had expected, though she was not sure why she had expected less. He had told her from the beginning that he managed a property, and she supposed she had simply not imagined that the managing would look like this, like actual engagement with actual people, like the same quality of attention he brought to everything else. The tenants responded to him the way the cat in the lane had responded, with initial caution, and then with the uncomplicated trust of creatures who can tell when they are being treated honestly. She watched him learn the names of all their children within the first fortnight. She did not comment on this, but she noticed it. Mother, resettled now into the Shropshire house with a degree of comfort she had not had in years, chose to regard the whole sequence of events as having been, more or less, her idea. Tilly let her. It was a small price for a large peace. The oak tree at the edge of the property, as it turned out, still stood. She showed him on a grey October morning, her hand in his, the grass wet underfoot, the hills going gold and amber in the late season light. "You climbed that," he said, looking up at it, "every summer until I was 15, she said. He studied it with the expression she had first noticed in the lane below the terrace, quiet satisfaction, the pleasure of a person in the presence of something that has endured. "Do you think you still could?" he said. She looked at the tree, thought about it seriously, as she had learned to think about things again, not as calculations, but as actual questions with actual answers that were hers to give. "Possibly," she said, "though I might want someone to stand below in case the branch situation has changed." He laughed. The real laugh, not the social one, the one that arrived without warning and changed his whole face. She had been collecting these without meaning to. "I can do that," he said. She stood in the October morning beside the tree she had climbed as a girl, in the life she had very nearly traded away, and felt, not the happiness she had been warned to expect, which always sounded in descriptions like something that arrived and stayed, but something quieter and more durable than that. The feeling of standing on ground that was solid, the feeling of having chosen. It was, she thought, enough. It was, in fact, more than enough.